The first time they stepped into my asparagus rows, I thought it was a mistake. The 15th time, I knew it was a business. The crunch hit me before I even reached the fence line. That soft, wet snap of fresh stalks bending under careless shoes. The kind of sound you don't forget when each spear takes 3 years to grow and about $8 a pound to sell. Morning fog still clung low over the beds, thin and silver, and I could already see the damage. Rows flattened in uneven patches, footprints pressed deep into the dark soil, like signatures nobody bothered to hide. My name's Ethan Walker, and this land isn't just dirt to me. 40 acres just outside Cedar Ridge, inherited, rebuilt, and turned into a high-end asparagus operation that supplies 3 restaurants in Austin that charge more for a plate than I used to make in a day. Every bed is mapped, timed, rotated. Every inch has a purpose. And every single one of those steps I was staring at right now, they cost me money. The wind carried something else that morning too, perfume. Not from the soil, not from the crop, from people who had no business being here. I didn't have to guess who sent them. Linda Prescott, HOA president, late 50s, always dressed like she was about to host a brunch fundraiser. Voice sweet enough to pass for polite until you listened closely and realized it came with terms and conditions. She ran Willow Creek Estates like it was her personal brand, not a neighborhood. Matching mailboxes, approved paint palettes, and apparently now, guided tours through my property. The first time I caught a couple walking through the rows, phones out, snapping pictures like they'd stumbled onto some kind of organic theme park, I kept it civil. Told them it was private land. They apologized, said Linda told them it was part of the community experience. I let it slide. Figured it would stop. It didn't. Week after week, more footprints. Different shoes, same path. Always cutting right through the center beds, the most valuable rows, the ones already under contract. I put up signs. Private property. No trespassing. Next morning, they were still there, selfies and all, smiling over plants they were. Killing one step at a time. I drove over to the HOA office, gravel popping under my tires, walked in with dirt still on my boots. Linda didn't even stand up. Just smiled like I was interrupting something minor. "Oh, Ethan," she said, folding her hands like we were discussing lawn decorations. "People love your farm. It adds value to the community." Value. I could still hear that word when I stood there in the cold that morning, staring at another set of ruined rows. Because here's the thing Linda didn't understand. Every step they took, every stalk they broke, every inch they crossed, wasn't just damage. It was data, and I had already started recording it. I grew up learning that good soil remembers everything, every season, every storm, every footprint, and standing there that morning I could already read the story written across those rows like a ledger nobody else knew how to see. The eastern beds were the worst hit, about 12 feet in from the fence line where the ground stayed soft from last week's irrigation cycle. Perfect for growing asparagus and apparently perfect for holding shoe prints like wet cement. Size 10s, maybe 11s, different tread patterns, some narrow heels that sank deeper than the rest, others flat and wide like running shoes. All of them cutting straight across the highest yield section I had scheduled for harvest in less than 48 hours. That section alone was tied to a standing order, 200 pounds a week to a place downtown that plated every spear like it was art and paid me accordingly. You do not just lose a crop like that. You lose contracts, reputation, future orders. And Linda knew exactly what she was doing, even if she dressed it up in polite words and neighborhood newsletters. I could still hear her voice from 2 days earlier when I stopped her outside the clubhouse, the faint hum of electric golf carts in the background, and the smell of freshly cut grass drifting through the air like everything was perfect. She tilted her head just enough to make it look like she was listening, but her eyes never really focused on me, more like she was already thinking about her next sentence before I finished mine. "Ethan," she said, slow and measured, "people are simply walking through. It is not like they are harming anything." I remember looking down at my hands, still stained with soil that had taken years to condition, and thinking how easy it must be to dismiss something you never built. "They are harming it," I told her, keeping my voice level because losing control would only make her smile wider. "Every step costs me." She gave me that same practiced expression, the one that could pass for concern if you did not know better. "Plants grow back," she said, like she was explaining something obvious to a child. That was the moment something shifted. Not anger, not yet. Calculation. Because people like Linda did not respond to warnings, they responded to consequences, preferably ones they could not talk their way out of. So I went back to the farm and stopped thinking like a farmer for a minute and started thinking like an engineer. Every bed on this property was already mapped, measured down to the inch for irrigation and rotation cycles, which meant I knew exactly where to place coverage without disturbing the crop. I spent that afternoon running conduit along the fence line, low profile, tucked beneath the same wooden posts that had been here since my father's time, feeding into a small control box mounted inside the equipment shed where the smell of diesel and fertilizer always hung in the air. By nightfall, I had the first set of cameras online, wide-angle lenses positioned just above eye level, angled down so they could capture not just faces but footsteps, weight distribution, direction of movement. Over the next 2 days, I expanded it, 1 unit per bed, each tied into a system that time-stamped every frame and overlaid it with a grid I had already built from my crop maps. This was not just surveillance, it was measurement. Every step would be logged, every damaged spear accounted for, every inch of soil disruption converted into numbers that could not be argued with. And the whole time, I did not say another word to Linda. I let the signs stay up, I let the paths remain open, and I watched as the footprints kept coming. Because the more they walked, the more they gave me. By the end of the week, the cameras stopped feeling like equipment and started feeling like witnesses, quiet and patient, watching everything the way I did, except they never blinked and they never forgot. The first full recording cycle came in on a Saturday, just after noon, when the sunlight hit the rows at an angle that made every shadow stretch long and thin across the soil. I was in the shed reviewing irrigation schedules when the alert came through, a soft chime from the monitor mounted above my workbench, barely louder than the hum of the generator. I wiped my hands on a rag and stepped closer, the smell of oil and dust hanging in the air as the feed pulled up automatically. For people, maybe 5, stepping through the side gap in the fence line where the posts sat a little wider than the rest. Casual, relaxed, like they had done it before. Phone's already out. One of them laughed, a sharp, quick sound that cut through the quiet of the field, even through the speakers. I watched as they moved deeper into the rows, right into the center beds, the same section I had flagged earlier in the week. And then it happened again, that soft snap, almost polite if you did not know what it meant, each step pressing down on spears that had taken 3 full seasons to reach harvest. I leaned in closer, not angry, not anymore, just focused. The system tracked everything automatically, timestamp running in the corner, grid overlay mapping their exact path down to the inch. Bed 12, row 3, then across into row 4. One of them paused, bent slightly, probably for a photo, and I could see the heels sink deeper into the soil, leaving a mark that would not smooth out until the next full till cycle. The software flagged it instantly, logging displacement, marking potential crop loss based on density and growth stage. Numbers started building in the corner of the screen, small at first, then stacking, each step adding to the total like a receipt printing in real time. $40, $80, $120, and they were still walking. I leaned back against the workbench, arms crossed, listening to the faint echo of their voices through the feed, and for the first time. Since this started, I felt something settle into place. Because this was not random anymore. It was consistent, predictable. Every weekend, late morning to early afternoon, groups coming through in clusters, always following the same path, always drawn to the same beds. That meant pattern, and pattern meant opportunity. I pulled up the archive and started scrubbing back through the past few days, watching the same behavior repeat with different faces, different shoes, same route, same damage. And then I noticed something else. They were not just wandering in. They were arriving in groups, spaced out by about 15 minutes, like there was some kind of schedule. I paused on one frame, zoomed in on a woman holding her phone slightly higher than the rest, screen bright enough to catch the reflection of a message. It was only visible for a second, but it was enough. A location pin, a time, and a name I already knew. Linda Prescott. I exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that clears everything out and leaves you with nothing but the next move. She was not just ignoring the damage. She was organizing it, turning my farm into a stop on some unofficial tour, feeding people into my property like it was part of the neighborhood amenities. I reached over and adjusted the settings, expanding the capture range, increasing the resolution, making sure every face, every step, every second was crystal clear. Because if she wanted to run this like a business, then I was going to treat it like one too. And every single one of her guests had just become part of the ledger. I stopped thinking in days and started thinking in cycles. Because once you see a pattern clearly enough, time stops feeling like something that passes and starts feeling like something you can position yourself inside of. By the second weekend, the footage lined up almost perfectly. Arrivals between 10:30 and noon, small groups first, then larger clusters as the day warmed up, like word was spreading in real time. I sat in the shed with the monitors glowing in front of me, the low hum of the equipment blending with the distant sound of car doors shutting somewhere beyond the fence line. Every few minutes, another alert, another group stepping through that same gap, shoes pressing into soil that had taken me years to condition. But now I was not watching damage. I was watching repetition, and repetition builds cases. I pulled up the overlay system and began tagging each individual path, assigning identifiers, mapping out not just where they walked, but how long they stayed, how many steps they took, how much weight they shifted into each bed. The software did most of the heavy lifting, but I refined it, adjusted thresholds, calibrated loss values based on growth stage and contract pricing. By the time the sun dipped lower and the light turned that deep gold that makes everything look more expensive than it is, I had something better than footage. I had structure. That night, I drove into town and met with Daniel Reeves, a contract attorney I had worked with once before when I negotiated my first supply agreement. His office smelled like polished wood and coffee that had been sitting just a little too long, and he listened without interrupting as I laid everything out, from the first footprints to the latest recordings. When I slid the tablet across the desk and played a clip, he leaned forward, eyes narrowing slightly as the grid overlay and timestamps rolled across the screen. He did not say anything until the video ended. Then he tapped the corner where the damage values had been logged. "This updates in real time?" he asked. I nodded. Every step. He leaned back in his chair, hands folding slowly like he was putting pieces together in his head. "You are not just documenting trespass," he said finally. "You are quantifying loss." That word sat heavier than anything Linda had said all week. Loss. Because loss can be argued. But quantified loss. That gets calculated. That gets enforced. I left his office with a list of exactly what we needed to make this airtight, higher resolution on facial capture, clear entry points, confirmation that no permission had been granted, and one more thing that made me pause at the door. "Let them keep coming," he added, almost casually. "The more consistent it is, the stronger this becomes." Driving back, the road stretched out, empty under my headlights, and I realized something that made everything click into place. Linda was not hiding this. She was promoting it, which meant sooner or later, she was going to scale it. Bigger groups, more traffic, maybe even an organized event. And if that happened, every single piece of evidence I had been collecting would not just stack. It would multiply. The next morning, I walked the fence line again, boots pressing into the same soil that still held the memory of yesterday's damage. I paused at the gap where they kept entering, looking at it for a long second before stepping back. I could have closed it. One board, maybe two, and it would have stopped everything overnight. But stopping it was not the point anymore. Not yet. I turned and walked back toward the shed, the cameras already live, already watching, because if Linda wanted to turn my farm into a destination, then I was going to let her build it all the way up. And when it peaked, that is when I would step in. By the third weekend, the pattern did not just repeat, it escalated. And you could feel it in the air before you even saw it on the screen. That subtle shift when something small turns into something organized. I was standing just inside the shed with the door cracked open, early light cutting across the floor, when the first car rolled past slower than usual, tires crunching over gravel like the driver was looking for something specific. Then another followed. And another. Not random anymore. Intentional. The monitor chimed, soft and steady, and when I stepped over to look, the feed lit up with more movement than I had seen all week. Groups arriving closer together, some of them talking like they already knew what they were about to see, pointing toward the fence line before they even stepped out of their cars. I watched one couple check their phone, glance at the time, then head straight for the same gap without hesitation, like they were following directions that had been given to them in advance. That was the moment it clicked. This was not just word of mouth anymore. This was scheduled. I pulled up the expanded capture grid, and zoomed in on their path as they crossed into the first row, the system immediately tagging entry point, assigning identifiers, tracking movement across the beds. The numbers started climbing faster this time, not in slow increments like before, but stacking in layers as more people followed behind them. Each step registered, each displacement logged, every damaged spear calculated against its projected yield. I could hear the faint echo of their voices through the speakers, excitement, laughter, the sound people make when they think they are part of something special, something they were invited to experience. And that word stuck with me. Invited. Because nobody just walks into private farmland like this without being told they can. I stepped outside for a minute, just far enough to hear it for myself. The distant murmur drifting over the rows, mixed with the rustle of leaves and the soft breeze moving through the field. It sounded like a small crowd, bigger than anything I had seen so far. When I went back inside, the feed confirmed it. At least 20 people on the property at once, spread across multiple beds, some taking pictures, others just walking, talking, unaware that every second they stayed, every step they took, was being recorded and measured down to the inch. I leaned against the frame of the door, arms crossed, watching the system do exactly what I built it to do, turning movement into data, turning damage into numbers that could not be ignored. Then I saw her. Not physically, not on the property, but on the screen of one of the guests, just for a second as she turned her phone toward a friend. A message thread, open and active. I paused the frame and zoomed in, adjusting the clarity until the text sharpened just enough to read. A name at the top, Linda Prescott. Below it, a message sent less than an hour earlier. Big group today. Best light around 11. Do not miss it. I let the image sit there for a moment, the quiet hum of the system filling the space around me, because that one line changed everything. This was no longer just negligence or denial. This was coordination. Promotion. She was feeding people into my property on purpose, timing it, optimizing it, treating my farm like it was part of her schedule. I reached over and saved the frame, tagging it, linking it to the rest of the footage, building the chain one piece at a time. Outside, the sound of footsteps continued, steady, careless, each one adding to a total that was growing faster than any of them could imagine. And for the first time since this started, I did not feel like I was reacting anymore. I was waiting, because if she was willing to organize something this big, then she was going to push it further. And when she did, she would not just be bringing more people onto my land. She would be bringing the moment I had been preparing for. The next move was not about catching them anymore. It was about proving intent, because there is a difference between someone wandering where they should not be and someone being sent there on purpose, and that difference is what turns a complaint into a case. I spent the next 2 days tightening everything, not visibly, not in a way that would change their behavior, but in ways that would sharpen what I was already collecting. I upgraded the capture rate on the cameras so no step blurred, no motion skipped, every frame clean enough to pause and read like a still photograph. I synced the timestamps across every unit so that no matter where they entered or how they moved, the timeline would hold together without gaps. Then I layered in something new, something Daniel had suggested with that same calm tone he used when he knew a situation was about to tip in our favor. I started correlating the footage with external signals. Arrival times matched against vehicle plates visible from the road edge. Message timestamps from the glimpses I could capture on their phones. Even the pattern of sunlight across the rows, locking in the exact hour each group passed through. It was not just video anymore. It was a timeline that could not be disputed. By midweek, I had enough to see the full structure of what Linda was doing. She was not just inviting people. She was staging it, posting times when the light was best, spacing groups so the field never looked crowded in photos, keeping the experience feeling exclusive while maximizing how many people moved through. It was efficient in a way that almost impressed me, if it had not been built entirely on ignoring the fact that the ground they were walking on was not hers. I drove back into town that afternoon and met Daniel again, this time with a full compilation queued up, clips stitched together so you could watch the entire pattern unfold in under 10 minutes. Groups arriving, crossing, leaving, then the next set coming in right behind them. Overlaid data ticking upward with each pass. He watched it twice without speaking, fingers steepled under his chin, then nodded once, slow and deliberate. This is organized use of private property without consent, he said, voice even. And with the financial impact you are documenting, it crosses into something much bigger. I knew what he meant without him having to spell it out. This was not just about stopping them anymore. It was about accountability. He outlined the next step carefully, like he was placing pieces on a board he had played on many times before. We needed one more push, one event large enough to remove any doubt that this was intentional and ongoing. Something that would show scale. She is building toward it, he added, tapping the screen where the group's sizes had been increasing. People like this do not stop at small wins. Driving back, the sky was clear, the kind of late afternoon blue that makes everything feel still for a moment, like the world is holding its breath. I pulled into the farm and walked the perimeter again, slower this time, noticing details I had ignored before. Tire tracks along the edge of the property where cars had been parking more frequently. A small wooden sign someone had stuck into the ground near the fence, hand-painted, pointing toward the rows like it was guiding people in. I crouched down, ran my fingers over the letters, and felt the rough texture of dried paint under my fingertips. That was new. That was not random. I stood up and looked out across the field, rows stretching in clean lines under the fading light, and for the first time I could see what she was trying to turn it into. Not a farm, a destination. I took the sign out of the ground and carried it back to the shed, set it on the workbench next to the monitors, and let the cameras keep running. Because if she was going to make this bigger, if she was going to invite more people and push it further, then I was not going to stop her. I was going to let her build it exactly the way she wanted. And when it was big enough that she could not deny it, that is when everything I had been collecting would come down at once. The announcement came exactly the way I expected it would, not hidden, not subtle, but polished and framed like something worth celebrating. I saw it first on one of the captured screens, a guest pausing just long enough for the camera to catch the full post before they stepped into the rows. I froze the frame and zoomed in, the pixels sharpening until the text became clear. Willow Creek exclusive farm walk experience. Limited entry this Saturday. Best light at 10:45. There was even a small icon of a ticket next to it. I did not need to guess who wrote it. I leaned back slowly, the chair creaking under me, and let the weight of that settle in. This was it. Not just coordination, not just promotion. Monetization. She had crossed the line from influence into transaction, turning access to my land into something she could package and distribute. I checked the timestamp on the post and matched it against the recent traffic patterns, and everything lined up too clean to be coincidence. Larger groups, tighter spacing, more consistent timing. She had been testing the flow, learning how many people she could move through without it looking crowded, and now she was scaling it. Saturday was going to be different. I spent the rest of that day preparing, not in a rush, not with panic, but with the same steady pace I used when setting up a harvest schedule. Everything had to be precise. I ran a full system check on the cameras, verifying angles, clarity, synchronization. I adjusted a few positions along the outer rows to widen the field of view, making sure entry points were covered from multiple angles. Then I expanded the storage allocation, clearing space so nothing would overwrite, nothing would be lost. If this was going to be the peak, I wanted every second of it intact. That evening, I called Daniel and told him what I had found. There was a brief silence on the line, the kind that comes when someone hears exactly what they were expecting. Good, he said finally, calm and direct. That is what we needed. He walked me through the final steps, confirming that once the event happened, we would have enough to move forward immediately. No delays, no warnings. Just action. I ended the call and stepped outside, the air cooler now, the field quiet in a way that felt temporary, like it was waiting for something. The rows stretched out in front of me, still and orderly, every bed aligned the way I had built it, every plant where it belonged. I walked along the edge slowly, boots pressing into the same soil that would be carrying dozens of footsteps in just a couple of days. I stopped at the gap in the fence again, the same opening I had left untouched this entire time. For a moment, I considered closing it, just to see what would happen. But that would change the outcome, and I was not interested in changing it. I was interested in finishing it. Saturday morning came with clear skies and a sharp, clean light that hit the field exactly the way Linda had described. By 10:30, the first cars were already lining up along the road, more than I had ever seen before, engines cutting off one after another, doors opening in quick succession. The sound carried across the property, layered and constant. I was in the shed before any of them stepped through, monitors already active, feeds filling with movement as people gathered near the fence line. Then, almost on cue, they started coming in. Not in twos or threes this time, but in waves. Groups merging into a crowd, following the same path, stepping into the same rows, spreading out across the beds like it had all been planned down to the minute. The system responded instantly, identifiers stacking, timestamps locking, damage values climbing faster than I had ever seen. It was not just data anymore. It was volume. I stood there, watching the numbers rise, listening to the steady rhythm of footsteps echo through the speakers. And for the first time since this began, I knew there was nothing left to wait for. She had built it exactly the way she wanted. And now it was complete. The moment it tipped was not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet shift in the numbers that told me everything had crossed from incident into evidence that could not be walked back. The monitor in front of me was filled edge to edge with movement, every camera feed active, every grid lit with identifiers stacking faster than the system had ever processed before. The sound of it came through the speakers in layers, footsteps over soil, low voices, occasional laughter, all of it blending into a steady rhythm that felt almost mechanical. I watched as the damage values climbed, not in small increments anymore, but in sharp jumps as entire sections of beds were crossed at once, multiple paths overlapping, compounding the loss in real time. Bed 12 alone crossed a threshold I had never seen, the projected yield dropping in seconds as dozens of steps registered across the same stretch. I did not react. I just reached over and locked the recording archive, sealing the entire session so nothing could be altered or overwritten, every frame preserved exactly as it happened. Then I picked up my phone and made the call I had already planned. Daniel answered on the second ring, his voice steady, like he had been waiting for this exact moment. "It is happening," I said, keeping it simple. There was a brief pause, then a single word. "Good." Within minutes, everything moved. Not on the field, not where the guests were walking and talking and taking pictures, but behind it, in the part they could not see. The footage began exporting in segments, each one tagged, indexed, cross-referenced with the timeline I had built over the past weeks. Entry points, movement paths, timestamps, visible communications, everything aligned into a structure that told a story without needing explanation. I stepped outside for the first time since the wave had started, just far enough to hear it without the filter of speakers. The air carried their voices clearly now, the sound of people enjoying something they believed was meant for them, completely unaware that every second they stayed was being converted into something else entirely. I looked across the rows, the clean lines I had spent years building now marked by uneven patches where the soil had been pressed down, the pattern of movement visible even from a distance. It would take time to restore, time I had already accounted for, but the cost was no longer just mine to carry. I walked back toward the shed slowly, the sun sitting high enough now that the light matched exactly what Linda had promised in her message, bright, even, perfect for photos. Inside, the system had finished compiling the first full segment, a continuous sequence from initial entry to peak crowd, complete with data overlays that tracked every step and every dollar of projected loss. I reviewed it once, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to see it as a whole, from beginning to end, the way it would be seen when it left my hands. It was clean, clear, undeniable. I sent the first batch to Daniel, secure transfer, no delay, then followed it with the rest, each file building on the last, each one reinforcing the same conclusion. When I set the phone down, the room felt quieter, not because the sound outside had changed, but because there was nothing left for me to do in that moment. The work had already been done. Everything that came next would not depend on what they said or what Linda tried to explain. It would depend on what was already recorded, already measured, already locked in place. I glanced back at the monitors one more time, watching the final wave move through the last set of beds, the numbers reaching a point that felt almost unreal, then leveling off as people began to leave the way they came. The system marked the end of the cycle automatically, timestamp closing the session with the same precision it had tracked every step. I turned off the main display and stepped outside again, the field still under the same clear light, the rows still stretching out the way they always had, only now carrying a record that could not be erased. And somewhere beyond the fence, Linda was probably already thinking about the next event, the next group, the next way to build on what she believed was working. She just did not know that. What she had built today was not something she could expand. It was something she had finalized. Monday morning did not come with noise or confrontation, just a quiet sequence of notifications that started before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. I was already in the shed when the first email came through, subject line clean and direct, no emotion in it, just process. Legal notice filed. Attached were documents I had already seen in draft form, now finalized, structured, and sent to every party that needed to receive them. Linda Prescott. The HOA board. A list of identified participants pulled directly from the footage, each one matched to a time, a location, and a quantified impact. I opened the first file and scrolled slowly, the familiar grid data now translated into language that carried weight outside of my field. Trespass. Unauthorized use. Commercial exploitation of private agricultural land. It read differently than it looked on the monitor, but it meant the same thing. Every step had a value. Every value had a consequence. By mid-morning, the second wave hit, not emails this time, but responses. Some immediate, some delayed, all of them shifting in tone from confusion to concern as the reality of what had happened began to settle in. I did not reply. There was nothing for me to explain that had not already been recorded. Around noon, I drove into town, same road, same steady hum of tires against asphalt, but it felt different knowing what had already been set in motion. Daniel met me outside his office this time, papers in hand, expression unchanged, calm the way it always was when things were moving exactly as planned. They received everything, he said, like he was confirming a delivery. I nodded once. That was all that needed to be said. The meeting that followed was not dramatic, no raised voices, no scenes, just a room full of people adjusting to information they could not ignore. The footage played once, then again, each angle reinforcing the last, each overlay making it harder to argue anything other than what was already visible. Linda sat at the far end of the table, posture still controlled, expression still composed, but there was a difference now, something tighter around the edges, like she was realizing that this was not something she could redirect with words. When the segment showing the message thread appeared, the room shifted, subtle but clear, attention narrowing, focus locking onto the part she had never expected anyone else to see. Timing, coordination, promotion. It was all there, aligned with the movement across the field, impossible to separate from the damage it produced. Daniel spoke when it was time, measured, precise, outlining the scope without exaggeration, letting the documentation carry the weight. Claims were filed. Liabilities established. The structure of what came next laid out in terms that did not leave much room for interpretation. I did not say much. I did not need to. By the time we walked out, the process had already moved past discussion and into resolution. That afternoon, I went back to the farm. The field looked the same from a distance, rows stretching out under a clear sky, the same lines I had worked season after season to build. Up close, you could still see where the soil had been disturbed, where the pattern had been broken, but it was already beginning to settle again, the surface smoothing out as if it was reclaiming itself. I walked down the center path slowly, boots pressing into ground that felt familiar again, steady, consistent. In a few weeks, new growth would come through, the next cycle already in motion beneath the surface. The contracts were still intact, adjusted but secure, and the demand had not changed. If anything, it had strengthened, because now there was something else attached to this place. Not just produce, not just yield. Proof. I stopped at the middle of the field and looked back toward the fence line where it had all started, the gap still there, unchanged, quiet now. I could close at any time, but I did not move, because the point was never the fence. It was what happened when people thought they could step past it without consequence. I let the silence settle for a moment, the kind that comes after everything has already been decided, then turned back toward the shed, knowing that what had grown here was not just a crop. It was a record, and every step they took, I turned into something they could not walk away from.